Pilot told passengers, ignore the black mechanic. She was the only one who could land the plane, ignore her, he said. Loud enough for 3 rows to hear. She's maintenance. She doesn't belong up here. The woman he was talking about stood in the forward galley of Meridian Air Flight 2247, a clipboard in her left hand and a torque wrench tucked into the chest pocket of her coveralls. Her name was embroidered above the pocket in gold thread, Devereaux. She had been on this aircraft for 11 minutes, called up from the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson after a hydraulic indicator flag tripped the avionics board during pre-flight. She had not said a word to the pilot. She had not introduced herself. She had simply walked through the forward door, opened the panel on the left-hand instrument bay, and begun to look. Captain Richard Holt stood in the cockpit doorway, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching her the way a man watches a stranger walk across a lawn he considers his own. "Folks," he said again, turning toward the first-class cabin, "we've got a little maintenance situation. Standard stuff. Nothing to be concerned about." He paused, and then he said it. "Just ignore the woman in the coveralls. She's not part of our crew." He turned his back on her before the last word left his mouth. But what Captain Richard Holt did not know, what no one in that first-class cabin knew, was that the woman crouched over that instrument panel held a certificate that most pilots would spend a decade studying for and still not pass. He did not know that she had been called to that aircraft, specifically because she was the only person on Hartsfield-Jackson's entire maintenance roster who had ever repaired this exact fault on this exact aircraft configuration. And he did not know that in 47 minutes, when both hydraulic systems failed at 31,000 feet over eastern Tennessee, the only human being on that plane who understood what was happening inside those walls would be the woman he had just told 312 passengers to ignore. He told the whole cabin to ignore her, out loud, on a live aircraft. Man, he had absolutely no idea. Let's get into it. Celestine Devereaux grew up in the bottom half of a duplex on Macon Street in East Point, Georgia, 2 miles south of the airport she would one day save. The bottom half of that duplex had a ceiling that sweated in summer and walls that went cold in January, no matter how high her grandmother turned the space heater. Celestine's grandmother, Ida Mae Devereaux, kept that heater on a short cord so it could reach the kitchen table, and she kept it pointed at Celestine's homework because she said that warm hands made sharper minds. Ida Mae worked the overnight cleaning shift at a hotel on Virginia Avenue and came home at 6 in the morning with her shoes tied in double knots the way she always did, and a grocery bag from the 24-hour store that usually had bread and sometimes had butter, and occasionally had a small container of orange juice that she left in front of Celestine's cereal bowl like it was a prize. The kitchen table was where Celestine learned to think. Not in a classroom, though she attended every day, and sat in the front row, and turned in every assignment. The classroom gave her the symbols. The table gave her the instinct. Ida Mae kept a jar of broken mechanical things in the center of that table the way other families kept fruit. There were clock gears and door hinges, and a carburetor float from a neighbor's dead Buick, and a solenoid valve from the laundromat down the street, whose owner, Mr. Tibb, had given it to Ida Mae when it failed, because he knew Celestine would take it apart and want to know why. Celestine was 9 years old when she first reassembled that solenoid valve, and she was 10 when she figured out how to make it work again. Mr. Tibbs put it back in the washer himself, and when it ran without a leak, he came to the duplex and pressed a $20 bill into Ida Mae's hand and said, "That child is not normal." Ida Mae folded the bill into her apron pocket and said, "She is exactly what she is supposed to be." The airport came into Celestine's life through a chain-link fence. She walked past the perimeter every morning on her way to school because it was the shortest route. And every morning she slowed down when the planes were taxiing, because there was always something different, always some piece of the machine moving in a way she hadn't cataloged yet. She started keeping a notebook, not about the planes themselves, but about what she could see of the maintenance crew. The carts, the tools, the panels they opened, the angles they crouched at, the way they moved their hands before they touched anything metal. By the time she was 12, she had filled 4 composition books. By the time she was 14, she had talked her way into a Saturday volunteer spot at a small general aviation field in Peachtree City, 40 minutes south, by writing a letter to the field manager that included, in 3 pages of hand-drawn diagrams, a proposed solution to a recurring fuel sensor calibration problem that had been grounding one of his Cessnas intermittently for 2 years. He did not expect the letter to be correct. He read it at his desk on a Tuesday night and called his head mechanic, who read it at the shop on Wednesday morning, and called the field manager back and said, "Who is this kid?" She was 14. She was on the honor roll at her high school. She rode the bus to Peachtree City every Saturday morning with a biscuit wrapped in foil that Ida May pressed into her hand at the door. She learned to do every task the mechanics would allow. She was not allowed to do much at first. She watched more than she worked. She asked questions that the mechanics answered because her questions were always the right questions, the ones that came from someone who had already thought through the answer and wanted to see if you had too. She applied to Georgia Tech on a Saturday in October of her senior year, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop balanced on a phone book because the hinge was cracked. She got in on early decision with a merit scholarship that covered tuition and most of her housing. She told Ida May at the table, and Ida May did not make a sound. She pressed both hands flat against the table for a long moment, and then she stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the street. And when she turned back around, her face was wet, and she said, "Your grandfather would have wept." Celestine's grandfather had been an aircraft mechanic at Dobbins Air Reserve Base for 23 years. He had died before Celestine was born. He had left behind his toolbox, a snap-on chest with a dent on the upper right corner, and his initials scratched into the bottom rail, ED. Celestine had kept it in her room since she was 7. She brought it to Georgia Tech in the back of a borrowed truck, and it sat under her dormitory bed for 4 years while she studied aerospace engineering and graduated 3rd in her class. She passed her FAA airframe and power plant certification examination on the first try. She passed her inspection authorization examination 2 years later, the youngest person on the examiner's record to do so. She joined Meridian Air's maintenance division as a junior technician and was promoted twice in 3 years. By the time she was 31, she held a specialty certification in advanced hydraulic systems for wide-body aircraft, a certification that required 18 months of study and a written examination that had a 37% pass rate. There were 11 people on the entire Meridian maintenance roster who held that certification. Celestine Devereaux was the only one assigned to Hartsfield-Jackson. None of this was visible from the outside. On the outside, what you saw was a woman in coveralls with a clipboard and a last name embroidered above her pocket. That was all Captain Richard Holt saw. That was all he wanted to see. Flight 2247 was a Wednesday evening departure from Atlanta to Chicago O'Hare, a route Holt had flown so many times he referred to it as his commute. He was 53 years old, 22 years with Meridian, and he wore his seniority the way certain men wear a watch they want you to notice. He walked the jetway the same way every time, slowly, with his jacket held over one shoulder, pausing at the door to let the gate agent see him before stepping on board. He accepted the first-class coffee before he accepted the weather brief. He addressed his first officer, a younger man named Gareth Webb, who had been flying with him for 8 months, in the shorthand of a man who had stopped being curious about his own aircraft. When the hydraulic flag tripped on the avionics board during pre-flight, Holt read the fault code and flagged it to ground crew the way a man flags an inconvenient piece of mail, with irritation rather than attention. He expected a standard reset and a clear. What he got instead was a call from the maintenance supervisor on duty, a man named Torres, who told him they were sending up their system specialist to take a physical look at the instrument bay. Because this particular fault code on this particular aircraft had a history. What kind of history? Holt asked. Torres said, "The kind you want looked at before you push back." Holt pushed his coffee away. He did not ask the specialist's name. When Celestine came through the forward door 11 minutes later with her clipboard and her torque wrench, Holt looked at her and looked away in the same motion. She walked past him without making eye contact because she was already reading the panel. She opened the instrument bay cover and felt the temperature of the housing and pressed 2 fingers against actuator mounting and checked the gauge lines from the port assembly. She had seen this configuration of symptoms before, not on this aircraft but on a sister aircraft at the Atlanta Maintenance Center 2 years earlier, and she had documented the failure pattern in a report that Torres had filed and that Holt had never read. because Holt did not read maintenance reports that were not addressed to him directly. She was on her second diagnostic pass when she heard him address the first-class cabin. She did not stop working. Her hand did not shake on the gauge line. She finished her read, made her notation, and straightened up. She looked at Gareth Webb, who was standing in the cockpit doorway behind Holt with his jaw slightly loose. Webb gave her a look that was half apology and half question. She turned back to the panel without acknowledging it. There was a young woman in the first row of first class, seat 1A, window, who had turned away from her phone and was watching with very still eyes. The woman's name was Amanda. She worked in risk management. She had heard every word. She was not looking at her phone anymore. Holt stepped back toward Celestine and said, "How much longer?" Celestine said, 10 minutes, maybe 12. He said, "We push in 8. Can you clear it or not?" She said, "I can tell you what I found in 10 minutes. He said, "I'll take that as a no," and he turned back into the cockpit. Nah. He cut her off before she could even finish her diagnostic. And there's a woman in 1A who just put her phone down and started paying very close attention. I'm just saying, let's keep going. Torres called the cockpit 2 minutes before pushback. Celestine had finished her diagnostic and handed Torres a written note through the forward door with 4 items listed. Torres read it and asked Holt to take a 5-minute delay on pushback while he consulted with the duty engineer. Holt said, "I've got a gate curfew and 300 passengers." Torres said the note was a caution flag, not a hold order. The aircraft was airworthy, but Celestine had identified a secondary hydraulic circuit behavior that could bear watching. Holt said noted, and he said it the way people say noted when they mean discarded. Celestine was escorted off the aircraft by the gate agent before the jet bridge retracted. She stood on the tarmac and watched the plane push back. She went back to the maintenance bay and wrote a full report. Torres read it and flagged it for the duty engineer, and the duty engineer was 3 calls deep on another aircraft and said he'd look at it in the morning. Nobody told the crew of Flight 2247 that the report existed. The aircraft climbed normally. The first hour was clean. Holt turned off the seatbelt sign at 10,000 feet and accepted his second coffee and talked to Gareth Webb about nothing in particular. The passengers settled in. Priya Mehta opened her laptop but found she was not reading what was on the screen. At 31,000 feet, over a dark corridor of eastern Tennessee, where the lights below were sparse, the primary hydraulic system pressure dropped. Not gradually. It went from nominal to critical in 11 seconds. Webb called it out before the alarm sounded, and Holt had his hand on the checklist before Webb finished the sentence. The backup system engaged automatically. Then, 4 minutes later, the backup system pressure also began to fall. Both hydraulic systems in simultaneous degradation on a wide-body commercial aircraft at cruise altitude is not a scenario covered in standard simulator training. It exists in the training manual as a theoretical event with a footnote about statistical probability. The probability is very low. The event was happening. Holt worked the checklist with controlled speed. Webb worked the radio. The aircraft was 112 miles from Nashville International, which became the emergency divert target. The problem was the hydraulics controlled the control surfaces. With degrading pressure across both circuits, Holt had flight controls, but they were getting heavier. He could hold altitude. He could hold heading. Landing was a different question entirely. Nashville approach cleared all traffic from the arrival corridor. Emergency vehicles began rolling to the runway threshold. Holt keyed the intercom to the cabin and told the passengers there was a mechanical situation being handled professionally and the aircraft was diverting to Nashville. His voice was controlled. His first officer's hands were less so. What neither of them knew was that the failure unfolding in the walls of that aircraft was the exact failure Celestine Devereaux had documented 2 years earlier in a report that had been filed and not read. She had identified a design-adjacent maintenance interval issue specific to the hydraulic actuator housing on this aircraft configuration. She had proposed a solution in that report, a specific pressure management procedure for a dual-system degradation scenario. That was not in the standard checklist because the scenario was considered theoretical. The procedure existed in her report and nowhere else. Torres had his radio on his hip when the emergency alert came through. He heard the aircraft designation and he went cold. He pulled up Celestine's maintenance note from that evening on his terminal. Then he pulled up her 2-year-old report. He read the procedure in Section 4. He picked up the phone and called the Meridian Air Operations Center in Atlanta. The Operations Center patched into Nashville Approach. Nashville Approach patched into the cockpit of Flight 2247. A voice came through the cockpit speaker. Not a controller voice, not a standard relay, and Gareth Webb looked up from his instruments with his brow furrowed, and Holt tightened his grip on the column. The voice on the radio said, "Captain Holt, my name is Celestine Devereaux. I'm the maintenance specialist who was on your aircraft at Hartsfield tonight. I have a pressure management procedure for the fault you're experiencing. Are you ready to copy?" There was a silence in the cockpit that lasted 3 seconds and felt like something structural shifting. Holt said, "Go ahead. Hold on. Just hold on for 1 second. The woman he told the whole first-class cabin to ignore, she's on the radio, at 31,000 feet, in an emergency. And he has no choice but to listen. I need everyone to really sit with that for a second." Okay, let's see how this plays out. Celestine spoke for 11 minutes without pause. She had her report in front of her, and she did not need it. She knew the procedure the way she knew her grandfather's initials on the toolbox she kept beside her desk. Not as something learned, but as something owned. She walked Holt and Webb through a staged pressure redistribution sequence that required manual valve adjustments in the right side, equipment bay, precise timing between steps, and a modified approach profile that would compensate for reduced control surface authority on final. It was not the checklist. It was better than the checklist. It was specific, and it was correct. Webb made the adjustments. Holt flew the sequence. The hydraulic pressure stabilized. Not to nominal. It would never reach nominal on that approach, but to a range that gave Holt control. He flew a wider approach arc into Nashville than standard, came in 2 knots higher than optimal, and touched down at Nashville International with the aircraft centered, and the emergency vehicles flanking the runway, and the cabin completely silent. The nose wheel came down, the thrust reversers engaged, the aircraft stopped, nobody moved for 4 seconds. Then someone in economy started clapping, and then the whole aircraft was clapping, and Priya Mehta in seat 1A was not clapping, because she was writing. In the notes application on her phone, with her hands shaking slightly, and her eyes very clear. Holt sat for a long moment with his hand still on the column. Webb said something that could not be heard over the intercom. Ground crews surrounded the aircraft. The forward door was opened from outside. At the maintenance center in Atlanta, Torres put down the radio and sat at his desk for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called his supervisor and said, "We have a situation that needs to go to the director tonight." The director of maintenance operations for Meridian Air was a man named Clifford, OC, and he was at home when Torres called, and he listened to the full account, without interrupting, and when Torres finished, OC said, "Get me Devereaux's file and get me the full maintenance history on that aircraft, tonight." He also said, "And pull the original duty log from this evening. I want to know exactly what was said on that aircraft before pushback." He already had a strong suspicion. He was correct. What OC found when he pulled the duty log was not a maintenance record. It was a document of deliberate dismissal. The cockpit intercom had been recording, as it always did, and the recording captured Holt's address to the first-class cabin verbatim. It captured his conversation with Torres. It captured the exchange with Celestine. It captured his notation of her preliminary report as noted, and the fact that he had never requested her findings. The recording also captured a moment 40 seconds after Celestine left the aircraft where Holt said to Webb, "Maintenance sends up whoever's available. Don't let it derail you." Webb said nothing in response, which the recording also captured. OC sat with his deputy director until 2 in the morning reviewing the file. By then, the Nashville incident had been officially classified as a serious incident under FAA reporting requirements, which meant federal investigators would be reviewing every decision made in the chain from pre-flight to touchdown. That chain included Holt's dismissal of the specialist report, his refusal to take the full diagnostic, and his instruction to the first-class cabin. The FAA investigator assigned to the case was a woman named Special Agent Denise Park, who flew into Nashville on Thursday morning with a laptop and a case file, and the particular patience of someone who has spent 15 years investigating things that almost became catastrophes. She interviewed Holt first, then Webb, then Torres. then every member of the ground crew who had been on duty that night. She interviewed Priya Mehta, who provided a written account that she had begun composing in her notes application before the aircraft had even stopped rolling, and which was 5 pages long and included a timestamp log. She interviewed Celestine Devereaux last on Thursday afternoon in a conference room at the Meridian Atlanta Maintenance Center. Celestine had slept 4 hours. She brought her report from 2 years ago, and her maintenance note from the previous evening, and her original certification documents in a folder that had her grandfather's initials written on the tab in her own handwriting. Special Agent Park read the 2-year-old report and then read it again. She looked up and said, "This procedure you developed, has it been submitted for advisory circular review?" Celestine said, "I submitted it through my supervisor's channel. I was told it would be reviewed." Park said it was not reviewed. Celestine said nothing. Park made a note. Then she said, "We're going to need this procedure, your name on it, to go through expedited review. What you described to the crew last night is going to be in the advisory circular for this aircraft type. I want you to know that." Celestine pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her, the way Ida May had once pressed her hands flat when something important arrived, and she looked at the investigator and said, "I'd like to know that it reaches the people who need it." Park said it will. On Thursday evening, Meridian Air placed Captain Richard Holt on administrative suspension pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The suspension was not voluntary. The airline's legal team had spent 8 hours assessing the liability exposure of the cockpit recording and had reached the same conclusion before the investigators did. The vice president of operations, a woman named Sandra Keene, personally reviewed the recording transcript and the maintenance chain and called Oze at home to say that what had occurred was not a gray area. Holt's union representative requested a closed hearing. Keene denied it. The proceedings would be internal but documented, and the documentation would be available to federal investigators. Gareth Webb voluntarily submitted a written statement to the FAA that corroborated the duty log recording and included an account of the moment Holt had told the cabin to ignore Celestine. Webb's statement did not use careful language. It was the statement of someone who had been present and had said nothing, and had decided that silence was no longer something he could justify. The recording of Holt's address to the first-class cabin, 18 seconds of audio in which he instructed 312 passengers to disregard the woman who would later keep them alive, was obtained by an aviation industry journalist on Friday afternoon. The journalist had a source inside the Nashville investigation, and she published a story that evening that included Celestine's name, the procedure she had developed, and the fact that the procedure was not in any standard manual because it had been filed and not reviewed. The story moved through aviation forums first and then through general news aggregators, and by Saturday morning it was not a niche story anymore. "Nah, man, he suspended Holt the same night." The first officer submitted a statement. "The FAA is involved, and now it's on the news. Everything is moving at once. Stay with me." The Meridian Air executive hearing on the matter of Captain Richard Holt and Flight 2247 was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Holt attended with his union representative and a personal attorney. He sat at a long table in a conference room on the 22nd floor of the Meridian headquarters building in Atlanta, with the windows looking out toward the airport in the distance. The room contained Sandra Keene, the VP of Operations, Clifford Oze, the Director of Maintenance, Special Agent Denise Park, present as a federal observer, 2 members of Meridian's legal team, and Gareth Webb, called as a witness. The Meridian board had also dispatched a representative, a senior director named Harold Faust, who said almost nothing but whose presence meant the board had decided this was not a matter to be managed at the departmental level. OC presented the maintenance chain first. He walked through Celestine's 2-year-old report, her maintenance note from the evening of the incident, Holt's conversation with Torres, and the cockpit recording. He did this methodically, without editorial. The facts were editorial enough. When he finished, Keene asked Holt whether he had read the preliminary maintenance note before pushback. Holt said he had been informed of it. Keene asked whether he had read it. There was a pause and Holt said he had reviewed it with Torres verbally. Keene asked again whether he had read it. The room was quiet. Special Agent Park said, "Captain Holt, for the record, the duty log indicates you received the written note at 6. 41 p.m. and pushed back at 6:53 p.m. The note was 4 items. It takes approximately 90 seconds to read. Did you read it? Holt said he had been focused on the gate curfew. Keene said, we'll take that as a no. The cockpit recording played twice. The 18-second address to the first-class cabin played both times without comment. There was nothing to add. Holt's attorney said his client had made judgment calls under operational pressure, and that the aircraft had been deemed airworthy by the maintenance supervisor on duty. Park said the aircraft had been issued a conditional caution flag, not a clear, which was a materially different designation. The attorney noted that Holt's record was 22 years and clean. OC said that Celestine Devereaux's record was 9 years and clean, and that her report had been filed and not reviewed for 2 years, and that she had been dismissed from an aircraft 12 minutes before it departed with an unresolved fault that she had personally identified. Webb was not asked to speak. He had submitted his written statement. He sat with his hands on the table and looked at the middle distance. At the end of the hearing, Keene recessed the room for 30 minutes. When she returned, she informed Holt that Meridian Air was terminating his employment effective immediately, citing conduct unbecoming of command authority, failure to follow maintenance protocol, and the creation of a hostile condition for a contracted specialist in the performance of her duties. His union representative said there would be a grievance filing. Keene said they should file whatever they needed to file. The FAA investigation would proceed independently and its findings would stand regardless. Holt was escorted from the building by a member of HR. He walked past the floor-to-ceiling windows with the view of the airport, and he did not look at them. In the conference room, after Holt had left, Special Agent Park addressed the room. She said that the FAA investigation would take its full course, and that she was not in a position to preview its conclusions. She said that the aircraft maintenance reporting chain at Meridian had failed at multiple points, and that the investigation would examine each one. She looked at OC and said, "Your specialist report should have been in an advisory circular 2 years ago. I want to understand the gap." OC said, "So do I." The journalist who had published the Friday story had a follow-up running that afternoon. It included a statement from Priya Mehta, who had given it willingly. It also included the text of Celestine's 2-year-old report, with Celestine's permission. The comments under the article ran to 800 within the first 2 hours, and the majority were from aviation workers, maintenance technicians, and former aircraft crew who wrote in the specific, detailed language of people who had been in that maintenance bay and had been that person at the panel and had heard some version of those words on some version of that aircraft, and who had never had their report read by anyone. The FAA investigation closed 7 weeks later with a formal findings report that ran to 41 pages. It cited failure of maintenance communication protocol at 2 levels above Celestine's supervisor. It cited Holt's conduct as a contributing factor in the degraded safety chain. It recommended an advisory circular update for the affected aircraft type that incorporated Celestine's pressure management procedure, with her name listed as the originating author in the technical documentation. The first time a field maintenance specialist's name had appeared in that capacity in an advisory circular for a wide-body commercial aircraft in 11 years. Park sent Celestine a copy of the relevant page with a single handwritten note in the margin. "This is permanent record." The duty engineer who had said he'd look at Celestine's evening maintenance note in the morning resigned before the investigation concluded. Torres received a formal reprimand and a mandatory retraining assignment. He accepted both without appeal, and in the meeting where they were delivered, he told his supervisor that the reprimand was fair, and that the failure of the review process was not something he could explain in a way that satisfied him either. Gareth Webb transferred to another Meridian base at his own request. He was given a written commendation for his voluntary statement to the FAA. He sent Celestine a message through the company internal system that said, "I should have said something in that cockpit before the door closed. I'm sorry I didn't. What you did on that radio was the most professional thing I have ever heard." She read it twice. She did not reply immediately. She wrote back 3 days later and said, "Keep saying something when it matters. That's the whole job." Meridian Air revised its pre-departure specialist briefing protocol. Under the new protocol, any maintenance specialist who boards an aircraft in the final pre-pushback window holds the same communication authority as the duty chief during the boarding period, regardless of rank or crew designation. The policy was written by OC. He showed Celestine the draft before it was finalized and asked if she would review it. She marked 3 places where the language was imprecise and returned it with notes in the margin in the same handwriting that had once filled composition books beside a chain-link fence. The journalist's story won a regional press award. In her acceptance remarks, she named Celestine and named the report and said the story had not required much journalistic skill. She said it had required only the willingness to read a document that had been sitting in a filing system for 2 years, waiting for someone to treat it as if it mattered. Priya Mehta published an essay in an aviation industry publication that ran under the headline, "What Happens When You Tell People to Look Away?" She described the 18 seconds she had heard from seat 1A in the measured, calibrated language of someone trained to identify risk. The essay was read widely within the industry. Meridian's VP of Operations forwarded it to the executive team with a single line, "This is what we built." The settlement that Meridian Air offered Celestine, both in recognition of the events of that evening and in acknowledgement of the 2-year delay in reviewing her report, was by Celestine's own direction, not retained personally. She directed it to a fund she established through Georgia Tech's Aerospace Engineering Department, designated for Black students in aviation maintenance programs. The fund was named the Edmund Devereaux Scholarship, for her grandfather, the man with the snap-on toolbox and the dent on the upper right corner. The first cohort was 12 students. She attended the announcement with Ida May, who sat in the front row of a Georgia Tech conference room in a pressed blouse and low-heeled shoes and pressed both hands against her chest when Celestine spoke, the way she always did when something arrived that was too large for words. Celestine spoke for 8 minutes. She talked about her grandfather's toolbox and the jar of mechanical things on the kitchen table and the composition books she had filled beside the chain-link fence. She talked about the FAA examiner who had told her after her inspection authorization exam that her pass rate was unusually high and asked what she had used to study, and she had said, "Everything I could find." She did not talk about the aircraft, or the pilot, or the evening over eastern Tennessee. She talked about what it meant to know a thing deeply enough to trust it when the situation became serious. And she said that kind of knowledge did not come from a classroom alone. It came from a person who believed you were worth teaching before you had proven anything. She said, "Find your table, find the person who keeps the jar, and fill the composition books while you still have the energy to fill them." Ida May did not cry. She had pressed her hands against her chest and gone very still in the particular way that meant she was holding something she intended to keep. After the announcement, Celestine walked to her car in the Georgia Tech parking deck, and she put her grandfather's toolbox, which she had brought in the back seat, on the passenger seat beside her, and she drove south on I-75 toward East Point, toward the apartment she now owned 12 blocks from the duplex on Macon Street, where the ceiling used to sweat and the space heater used to be. Pointed at the homework, and she drove past the airport perimeter. And the landing lights were on, over the runway, and the planes were moving, and she watched them the way she had always watched them, not with wanting but with knowing. And she drove home. Yo, I need a minute with that ending. Because this story, every single piece of it, the clipboard, the toolbox, Ida May pointing that space heater at the homework, the radio call at 31,000 feet, it all came together exactly the way it was always supposed to. Now this is a fictional story. But every single thing it captures, the expertise that gets dismissed, the reports that don't get read, the person in the room who knows exactly what to do and gets told to be invisible, that is real. That happens. You know it happens. And I need to ask you something directly. How many Celestines are out there right now, in the maintenance bay, in the classroom, in the meeting, with the right answer and the right credential and somebody's back already turned? Think about that. Drop your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you think. If this story hit you the way it hit me, hit that like button right now. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you doing? We are telling these stories every week, every single week. Subscribe and do not miss the next one.